On this week's episode, I'm joined by Joe Fattorini. Joe is an award-winning marketer, a wine enthusiast, and the presenter of the very popular TV program, The Wine Show. We discuss, amongst other things, filming season 3 of The Wine Show right here in Portugal, an actor who may or may not have cried while drinking Portuguese wine, and what Joe finds so very, very special about Portugal. Welcome back, or welcome to another episode of Portugal, The Simple Life. I'm really excited to be joined here by Joe Fattorini. Joe, welcome, and thank you so much.
Well, it's nice. In some ways, it's very nice to join you. I only wish I was actually in Portugal. And it was the last place I went to before we weren't allowed to travel anymore. So I left pretty much the last day it was possible. So I really wish I was in Portugal with you right now.
Be much better if we were doing this interview over a glass of nice red or something, sitting at a vineyard or something. It would be better.
I'm already starting to sort of plan because, you may well ask me. I've got various favourite grape varieties, so I think I actually will probably be going for Arinto, which is one of my new favourite discoveries, and I'm telling everybody they need to drink more Arinto since we've been in Portugal. But we can come on to that in a bit.
Let's do it. Joe, why don't you just start off by telling us a little bit for our British listeners? You probably don't need any introduction, but if you just start off telling us a little bit about you.
Well, funnily enough, there are some parts of the world where there are groups of people who know me quite well. I'm actually speaking to you from Sweden, and I get seen a lot around here because the Wine Show, which I present, is shown every night of the week in Sweden, as I've just discovered, and indeed in Norway. So we do very well. So I present a TV show called The Wine Show. We've just made our 3rd series, and our 3rd, it's always that difficult 3rd album. Well, actually, for us, it was much easier because we were in Portugal and we had a fabulous time. So I present along with a slightly rolling roster of 2 actors. So we have Matthew Good, who's very famous, particularly for The Crown, which he appeared in, and Downton Abbey and various shows. Discovery of Witches, which we have a lovely relationship with Discovery of Witches fans. Matthew Rhys from The Americans, so very well known, particularly in the US. He's currently doing a lot of work with Steven Spielberg. He was in The Post and shows like that. He's also been in that what's the detective series? There was a detective series that came out last year, which was great. And then gradually in sort of series 2 and 3, you were joined by James Purefoy, who's a brilliant actor. He was in HBO's Rome. He's a great wine fan. And in fact, there's a bit in our Portuguese series where he ended up bursting into tears because he enjoyed the wine so much. It really literally reduced him to tears, and we thought he was acting. He wasn't. He said, "No, I can't act that good." He said, "I really it moved me to tears." And then I ended up in the Douro with Dominic West, probably best known for The Affair and The Wire, shows like that. Who was a brand new member of our team, and it somewhat took him away, I think. I mean, not only being in Portugal and in the Douro Valley on his first in the Wine Show, he comes to the Douro Valley, to Quinta do Noval, to drink, I think it was something like 60 wines in a day. And it was quite a party at the end of that day. So we're in 108 countries around the world, and it is the world's greatest job. I go around the world and drink wine and meet lovely people like you, Dylan.
Amazing. If you need help with that one day, just let me know. I'll check my schedule.
There are a number of you get some great things, and I'm probably the only person in the world where women sort of say, "No, you can pack me in your luggage." You do realize that sounds really weird. I'll do anything to come to sort of help you out at the Wine Show. We do get very willing participants when we all go away together, and we film it in various bits, but when we all get to go away as a gang, which is the best bit. And you know what, you can't make a show like this without it being a kind of family thing. I mean, we all know each other incredibly well. Everybody piles in and we all have an absolute party, and we work pretty hard. But if you can imagine, at the end of the day, you've opened 60 bottles of wine and there's a crew of maybe 25, 30 of you with all various people around and about. It's a good evening, and the only rule is you can have as much as you like, but you've got to be back on set the next morning ready to rock and roll, and we always are. So those are our rules.
Good stuff. Yeah, well, I mean, this is how we got in touch. Was I was sitting at home with my wife. We were watching some television. We saw an advert for the Wine Show, and that you guys had come to Portugal. And I said to my wife, I said, I need to speak to Joe. I need to get Joe on the podcast. So here you are. So thank you. I'm really, really delighted and honored. I mean, your relationship with Portugal goes back longer than just this show. When was tell us about your first visit to Portugal and when that was.
Well, like lots of British people in the wine trade, of course, I visited Portugal virtually, in a sense, rather than actually in person, because I think particularly young British people in the wine trade, and I am old enough, in a sense, to be at the slightly more traditional end, where my first jobs, we were selling, well, particularly lots of port, and so you got to know about the Methuen Treaty and that very long trading relationship. And I came from the north of England, which was wool country. All the people around us, all the money had come from wool. Bradford as a city where my family, the Italian Fattorini, settled, and around where my mother's family all came from, were very much all in wool. So part of my family were mill owners, mill workers, and then subsequently mill owners in the sort of wool heartland. Of course, that was all trundled across to Portugal to go and get made into fabric, and then wine came the other way. And there was a lovely sort of full circuit bit, actually, because we went when we were in Setúbal, and we went into this huge wine warehouse, and it turned out it had been used to make as a wool factory. It made fabric, made cloth, and in fact had been making lots of British military uniforms in the 19th century. And I was there suddenly thinking, I'm walking into history. I come from where the wool comes from. The Methuen Treaty has all the trading. I'm now standing in a wine warehouse that used to go and use Yorkshire wool to make Portuguese cloth that was then turned into British fabrics that went into military uniforms in the Peninsular War. I was like, oh, my head is spinning. There's too much history going on all in here. And I remember first visiting as a sort of wine journalist. I wrote for a newspaper called The Herald in Glasgow.
Okay.
Lived in Scotland for a very long time, 18 years, and wrote for the paper there for about 14, 15 years. And one of the slightly odd, there's a real hierarchy in wine writing. I have a great friend who was a senior correspondent within the White House Press Corps, and he said even in the White House Press Corps there is there's less of a hierarchy than there is amongst wine writers. The rules about who gets to go in which seat on Air Force One are less rigidly enforced than who gets invited where in the UK Wine Press Corps. But as a regional newspaper writer who wasn't part of the London circuits and all the hadn't won awards, you get the slightly sort of second tier trip. So I didn't get to go to Australia or New Zealand. I didn't get long haul very often. I got Greece and Portugal and places like that, where actually you find the much more interesting stories. So I remember coming 20 years ago and broadly being based in Porto, which is where most wine trips tend to go. I think actually now we're getting much better at, get people to the islands and get people to Alentejo, get people to the far north. But from there, we would obviously look at the Douro, and then we would go down Bairrada and visit what was still then up and coming producers. Even guys like Luis Pato, who were seen as slightly sort of breakthrough producers. They're legends of the wine world now, but even then they were, still seen as slight sort of outliers. And we had a fabulous time. It was about 3 years ago when we came and we filmed in Portugal in series 1 with my co-presenter Amelia Singer, and we came and went along the river. Did the fairly standard sort of story. But then we kept coming back, and there's a few people said, we'd love you to come and maybe be based here. And so we came, and I gave some speeches at the Custom House, and there was all the producers there. And we gradually would come on these little trips. I went to stay with a friend of mine who's got a lovely quinta the Mont Esperança, so just sort of north of Lisbon, not far from sort of Ericeira. So we went and got windswept by Atlantic coastal breezes, and it felt like one of those Perthebus, little goose barnacles. I actually know what it feels to be like one of those by standing on the beaches in Ericeira. Absolutely howling, salty winds. But then you get to understand that part of the world much better. And then we came to make the show, and so we were backwards and forwards all the time through particularly 2019 and the early part of 2020. So I feel like got to know it considerably better, I think, but not as well as you. You're going to tell me places I've never even been.
We might get into that. But those initial trips, what were If you could just shed some light for us on what were some of your expectations of Portugal, and what were some of the things that surprised you about Portugal, things that you maybe didn't expect to happen or to experience while you were here those first couple of trips?
There are extraordinary similarities about Portugal and the UK. You know, they both sit slightly on the edge of Europe. You know, Britain on a sort of north-western side and Portugal on the sort of southwestern side. They're both quite coastal nations. I mean, Britain's entirely surrounded by the sea, but Portugal's mostly surrounded by the sea, and then obviously villains on the other side of the mountains. Terrible demons who sit on the other side of the mountains.
Yes. And their wine is way worse than ours.
In some senses, both have had, you know, a slight sense of insularity in a way. I mean, they've both been great imperial nations. Both have had extraordinary global influence, and potentially, I suppose, periods of, you know, isolation. But they have both emerged slightly phoenix-like, you know, chrysalis-like, particularly in their culinary traditions. And you know, I've got Nuno Mendes' book, Lisbon, which, you know, I love. And the thought of making that 20 years ago would have been kind of hard. And finding an audience for it 20 years ago is hard. Now people fall over themselves to go and find amazing books about Portuguese food. That was certainly one part. I'm a terrible one that I don't necessarily turn up. You know, sometimes people come and go, well, I never knew this or I never knew that. I'm dreadful because usually for the week before we go anywhere, largely because this is my job, I have to sort of turn up and know interesting things about the place I'm going. Yeah. I'm not really allowed to come and go, well, I never knew that. I kind of have to know. So I end up reading lots of books. So it was when I arrived, I already knew things like, you know, Portugal has had an extraordinary modernization. You know, it's experienced massive sort of transformation and change. I knew about the pride in things like fado and some of the sort of folk arts and singing and craft and so on that have enjoyed a real revival and a you know, rightful revival. I think there's been some extraordinary work in trying. I mean, it's one of the, you know, you go to Lisbon particularly, but also in some of the other cities where they've brought together the best, or often quite modern interpretations of what the cities are about, but really integrating that in this sort of fascinating way with this extraordinary history. I mean, you've got one of the tiles behind you, and you find these beautiful tiles next door to uber modern buildings. And I love that kind of thing. And I think in that I sort of knew I was coming into and to expect, but I didn't quite realise that it's still a country. And I think one of the things that, you know, we did find out, and there are good sides and bad sides to this. It remains a bit like Italy, not one country, but something of sort of federal agglomeration of villages who broadly and in general agree to sort of go along with the consensus, but frequently have usually enormous disputes with the people who live about half a mile away. And
we're very territorial in Portugal. Luckily, it never kind of translates into politics or religion. But it translates into food and wine. My wine is better than yours, and our food, we do this pastry better, and we do this dish better than the village 10 kilometers away. It's amazing.
I discovered the mistake. I tell you, I did discover the mistake of saying, oh, well, I had whatever pastry it was, you know, in the next village, and then discovering that this is an abomination. It should never be allowed. It's a disgraceful thing. And you think it looks pretty much identical to the thing you've just given me, but apparently the one I had yesterday is absolutely terrible. No, it's got it all wrong. The custard is incorrect consistency. There's the wrong proportion of custard to pastry in that. The pastry, oh crikey, they wrote that all wrong. And you realise that there is, in Italy, they use this term Campanilismo, this sort of notion that your loyalty is within the sound of the bells ringing in your church tower, and once you leave that, you know, sort of echo, then you're in another world. And there was that. Hopefully, one of the things we've done is we've shown people in the wine show Portugal's this extraordinary place. It's very diverse. It is far more diverse than most people give it sort of credit for. Not only north to south, but actually more importantly, east to west. It's a bit like Chile in that sense that your distance from the ocean is almost more important than your distance top to bottom. It certainly has, you know, the left to right movement is a more fine tuning than the north to south sort of movement. You can drive north to south on kind of the same thing and it doesn't change very much. You can go left to right in, 30 kilometers and the world's a different place. And that it has this very rich history, which it is beginning to be able, not beginning, it is able to go and share with the world. And, so wine and food, yeah, they do sit in. People are it's a very, very protective over there.
In Portugal, we are very, very passionate about. We argue about a lot of things. So football, we argue about football, food, and wine a lot more than what we argue about religion or politics, which I find so refreshing here. It's a wonderful way of life. But I think another thing that surprised me and still surprises me now is how Portugal is so connected to almost every part of the world. And I love that episode of that you guys did in Porto, in that trade house that had the little trap door for the men or whoever they were there with to escape. And it was just brilliant. But it just showed me the how Portugal has somehow managed this connection with so many different cultures and so many different places in the world. It was absolutely fascinating. And still, I get surprised by that. You've got the Arab influence, you've got the Chinese, you've got the British, there's a deep connection with the Dutch. It's just phenomenal to see how this little country has such a far reach and connections.
You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things with the show is that we one of the great challenges of making a wine television program is that on the whole, wine is quite boring. A bottle of wine's quite boring, and especially on television.
Don't say things like that. It's not boring. There's nothing boring about a bottle of wine.
Well, that was one of the challenges, that on television it presents this extraordinarily fascinating, interesting, in a sense, a lens on the wine world. It's a terrible pun. But on TV, a really great bottle of wine looks like a really terrible bottle of wine. And somebody drinking a bottle of wine, well, you're not doing it. So that in itself is a relatively boring thing. It's not like food where you can see this, somebody building it all up and it becomes, a bit more immersive. It's a bottle of wine. And yet, when you say, well, where did it come from? What influenced it? Then the world opens up. And what made Portugal interesting, it's not the world's biggest wine producer. It's not the world's best known wine producer. It's not, there's a whole series of things where people will say, well, why do you not go to all these other countries that are bigger, better known, whatnot, win more awards? Actually, there are very few countries in the world that would argue in the same way that they've had a kind of global impact and have been changed as much by the rest of the world through the wine trade. And you take an individual strand and you go off on all sorts of quite interesting details. So we went to Madeira, one of the favorite sort of bits. Interesting, we're talking today on Inauguration Day in the United States. The history of Madeira and Portugal goes right the way back to the founding fathers, and they toasted the Constitution with a glass of Madeira. And in drinking in the South was Madeira because people didn't have fridges and it was the only wine that would survive. But we were trotting around one of the Madeira houses, and there was a guy making he was rebuilding a barrel, and we got sort of chatting, and I sort of said, well, where does all the wood come from? The lady said it was very interesting. She said, what happens is they rebuild the barrel, they get rid of some staves when they're totally done in, but there'll be some very old staves and some newer ones, and they gradually build the whole thing up. And she said, of course, the interesting thing is that the Madeira grows no oak at all. The oak doesn't come from Madeira. She said, we import some now from various parts of the world, but she said there are still quite a lot of oak staves in barrels in Madeira that were originally harvested from ships that had sailed to Madeira. So you think, cracking, that's amazing. I mean, you've got these old wooden-hulled ships that were broken up and the wood was turned into staves. And some of those staves are still in existence. If you work on the basis that the last sort of wooden-hulled ships would have come to Madeira more than 100 years ago. So you got some wood in there that's 100 years old from the ship. Incredible. Well, it come from the ship, which might have been sailing for another 100 years. So right now we're going back, maybe more than 200 years for some of this wood. Now it's been built out of American oak, which has come from the United States. So actually some of these saplings have come from trees that might be 300-400 years old. So suddenly you're stretching back in history that today you can drink Madeira, made in the island of Madeira, and it is influenced by wood that was planted before the West ever made it to Madeira, around probably the era that the Vikings were getting there. That was when the saplings started to come up. And you go, oh my goodness, I'm tasting back the thick end of 1,000 years, certainly 600 years, in the wood that is actively having a part of my wine. And of course, in that you can then say, well, Madeira then does all these amazing things. Then, of course, you go down to the front and there's the Ronaldo statue, and he looks utterly bizarre and weird. And that brings you crashingly back into the 21st century at a very sort of rapid pace. But, it's not just that you tell an interesting story. You could go out tomorrow and drink that wine. I mean, you could go out, the oldest bottle of Madeira I was in a shop and we had a bottle of Madeira that was dated to the 18th century. I think it was 1791. That we sold to somebody. Now you start to think, right, let's start doing the maths on a bottle of 1790 something Madeira. Right, now we go sort of way back. And I once drank a South African wine, funnily enough, from 1791. And, I remember thinking, it blew me away then that was the year Mozart died. And you're sort of going that far back. Actually, it's quite a lot, not a lot, but relatively, you can still go and buy wines from the 19th and even back into the 18th century from Madeira. There's still drinking very well now. And then when you think about the components that went into that, how far back they go, and then we started on food. So then we went off and you go into, Vindaloo, the interactions with India and like you say, sort of China. So those relationships gone both ways.
But you see this happening throughout history with Portugal, where they're not afraid to take something from somewhere else and say, okay, let me use that here. We'll do it our way, but they're not afraid to go. And also they're never afraid to give credit that this idea wasn't ours. This idea came from that little country in that neck of the woods, and they still use it. And it's incredible to see that interconnectedness and that sort of openness to learning and working with people from all over the place. Have you seen that in terms of the winemaking and things like that as well?
To a degree, I think the winemaking's had a challenge in some ways, and it's been stunted slightly by history. I mean, it was certainly true. I mean, you're absolutely right. You think about some of the spiciness and some of the sort of the heat that exists in parts of Piri and things like that, which have clearly been influenced by being a colonial global, say power, but it's sort of certainly a colonial force, and being a trading nation sort of around the world. And it has both taken those sort of things into its own food, and then it's given back through dishes like vindaloo, which have then gone into India. And there's always that combination of this. Some things are, this tastes nice, and the other things are, this is the only way I can think of doing this because of the practical constraints. So you end up with these two influences that sort of come together depending on where you're at. With the wine world, one of the challenges in the 20th century was Portugal. Its wine business was very heavily turned into cooperatives, and cooperatives can be, and sometimes are, very good ways of going and effectively elevating the quality of wine and being able to give people big markets. One of the challenges, though, it sort of caps that, so you don't get the peaks of real excellence that sit at the top. And Portugal, I think, has an excellent wine producer, as one that was sort of known globally, was to some degree that flame was kept alive, particularly by the Anglo-Portuguese families of the Douro Valley. And I think they've also probably led one of the big innovations in Portuguese wine in the last 40 years or so, which was still red wines and now still white wines from the Douro. If there's one wine I want people to go away and drink, Burgundy, I love it. It's really nice wine, but unless you are drinking the very top end of Burgundy, for most purposes, go and drink white Portuguese Douro wines, oak aged or not, Douro whites. They have that similar mid-weight, attractive fruit that works quite well with oak, that's really good for food matching, that everybody kind of gets on with. They're these perfect wines to generally entertain with. And a friend of mine, Sophia, Quinta della Rosa, she makes these white wines, and it's one of those things, is my kind of go-to. You go, all right, make sure we've got a case of that, because we can go and serve this when we need kind of go-to wines. So I think those still wines gave people the confidence that they could go and play around. And then you look at, I remember 20 years ago visiting Quintas dos Roques, and he was experimenting with single grape varieties, and rather than just blending everything, people started to say, well, maybe we can play with some of these single grapes. Luis Pato did the same in sort of Bairrada. I think sometimes when regions realized that there was an interesting kind of proxy. So Alentejo, I think, it's enjoyed something of a revival because it suddenly said, we are sort of Italianate. And actually, Italian wines have a particular style. They tends to be quite there's real ripeness, but it's matched often by, quite a precise acidity about it. There's almost a slightly balsamic character sometimes. And Alentejo realized that they could do that really, really well. And so suddenly they sort of say, well, we're a little bit Italianate. And then suddenly people know which bucket to put you in. The one thing I think that people forget about Portugal, and this was where for a long time, and it's only now being recognized that it was a real global leader, was that Portugal was one of the first countries in the world to really understand the power of brand and appealing to a broader audience. The port houses did it. People tend to sort of tie into a port house. But actually, Matius Rosé is one of the greatest wine innovations in history, and I stand by it. I think it's it's an extraordinary wine. It's introduced millions of people into the world of wine, but also brands like Periquita, where there's this consistency over time, and people say, I just quite like Periquita. Something about some Periquita, and really old historic kind of brand, but people sort of bought into the idea that it was a great thing just to have in the house. I drink Periquita red; it's really nice. And now one of the things Matius Rosé is sort of enjoying a bit of a revival is because somebody found some photos. There's quite a famous photo of Jimi Hendrix drinking from the neck of a half bottle of Matius Rosé. It's a brilliant picture. If you're listening, go look it up afterwards. It's an amazing.
I will, yeah.
Jimi Hendrix drinking half a bottle of
amazing. And I didn't know that.
And that actually really brings it home that was how significant and important it was. It remains one of the world's big wine brands.
Yes.
A friend of mine, Artur, Portugal continues to this. Artur sells wine, particularly in places like Mozambique and Angola, which are surprisingly, and Brazil, actually. Brazil, one of the world's largest wine markets, and often forgotten about. And that Portuguese expertise and understanding and experience of creating approachable brands. Artur told me he had a lovely story. He has I think it's a brand called Caballo Blanco, White Horse. And it's, I think, the most successful wine brand in broadly Lusophone Africa. And all these other big global players couldn't work out why this relatively small Portuguese producer had the most successful wine brand in these fast expanding wine markets. And he said, it's really easy. It's because I go to Angola. I know people from Mozambique, his family. He's had long relationships there, and he said, I know lots of people, the literacy rates aren't necessarily as high as they could be. He's very involved actually in children's education, and so he said it was really important that if you're going to call it the White Horse, well, you have a picture of a white horse on it, so everybody comes in and says, can I have a bottle of the White Horse? And it doesn't matter whether they read or not. And so suddenly that's the answer, and everybody drinks White Horse because they can see the brand. And Portugal is an amazing innovator. It's often, it has great history of inventors and explorers in the past. That continues to this day, and that's it's a nice thing to have ticking away in the background.
I find that with we're not massive producers of wine here, so you have countries that are producing en masse, whereas Portugal seems to still be producing limited amounts of wine. A lot of that's got to do with the geography, I think, as well, and the areas. But there's always a story behind the wine. There's a story behind the wine farm. There's a story behind the quinta. There's a story behind the family. There's a historical connection, maybe. And I find that there's always a really fascinating story behind a lot of our wines. Now that you've gone to all these different places, are you seeing the same thing?
Yeah, and one of those nice parts about Portugal, in a way, you get multiple layers of stories. So individual producers have great tales, but then often one of those things that really adds a layer into sort of Portugal's wine industry, because one could sort of argue, if you travel around the world, wine producers all sort of say, well, I have a story. Tragically, the stories of most wine producers is almost always the same. It's either my dad gave it to me and I've sort of made it a success, or I've made an awful lot of money and I bought it and I've made a great success out of it. There tend to be not very many variations on that. One of the great challenges is saying, nobody really wants to hear that your dad gave you a vineyard and you're now very successful. But within Portugal, you're absolutely right. There were individual sort of tales, and I think particularly because Portuguese wine in the post effectively the post-Salazar era, the sort of post-cooperative era, has had to reinvent itself. It's had to break itself apart from all those all those big cooperatives. It's had to find new markets, and it's often had to reinvent quite old historic names for a sort of new era. So wines, Arinto, I mean, globally an incredibly obscure grape variety. The Duke of Wellington imported Arinto into London, and it was little known that he was a sort of part-time wine merchant, but he imported it and sold it under the name of, I think he called it Portuguese Hock, I think he called it, because Hock in Germany was the big thing, and sold a lot of it. It was his favourite grape variety. Now, you sort of think, right, 200 and something years ago, the Duke of Wellington was going and selling Arinto in London hugely successfully. He was one of the great, it's a bit like going and having, I don't know, some famous general of our era going and doing, Colin Powell selling wine in the United States. And yet it then disappears and it has to come back out. And I think a lot of Portugal's really fascinating wine stories, because great wine stories are often about, triumph over adversity. And the entire wine trade, really the wine business, faced considerable adversity for a large chunk of the 20th century and has had to emerge out of that as individuals, estates, as, and it does face other challenges where it has to tell the story better than a lot of other countries. Large parts of the United States, the story of the winemaker is, we are really good at making Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, it means that you already tie into an existing story, the story of Cabernet Sauvignon or the story of California. If you're making, I don't know, it's sort of Ashgonacam, some really obscure grape variety in Bairrada, there is no existing Bairrada framework. There is no existing Ashgonacam framework, and your own sort of brand is totally unknown outside of your local region. So then you have to go and work much harder to go and break through. And there are these great questions, should Portugal be proud or hide away from its autochthonous, its indigenous grape varieties? It should absolutely not work away from them, partly because I think that's where its real interest lies, but also partly because it does put Portugal actually in a very strong position globally to tackle climate change. We're now very interested in those countries who preserved this big biomass of interesting grape varieties. And we're already seeing Touriga Nacional, great Portuguese grape variety, is now authorised for planting for basic level Bordeaux because it can cope with the heat so much better.
Interesting.
Thank goodness everybody didn't just uproad Touriga Nacional and put Syrah in its place. Otherwise we'd be stuffed, we wouldn't have that plant. I don't know if anybody's watched Queen's Gambit. It's brilliant because there isn't an obvious story to play. It's just tell about somebody playing chess. It's quite hard to go and think, well, how do I go and tell a story about somebody playing chess? Well, you've got to work really, really hard to make that. It took them 10 years or whatever, but they tell a brilliant story. Portugal's winemakers are the Queen's Gambit of wine storytellers, in that it's quite hard to tell a story about a region nobody's heard of, a great variety nobody's ever drunk, in a country that people don't particularly associate as one of the great winemaking regions of the world.
Yeah.
Now your work's cut out.
Yeah, that's interesting. The one thing that we interviewed a woman called Marta Mendonça a couple of weeks back, and she's heading up the Porto Protocol, which is and so when you're talking about the climate change, and that's they've managed to create a platform where for the first time winemakers are actually sharing information with each other, because the purpose of the platform is climate change and to prevent climate change. So it's quite fascinating what they've managed to create, so it's headed up by Taylor's, by Adrian Bridge, but they all talk to each other and share information with each other about the glass bottles, the watering systems and all of that. But the other thing that you spoke about, Joe, and I wanted to just ask you, is the grape varieties, because we had a Michelin star chef a week ago on the podcast, Hans Neuner, who has a restaurant in the Algarve Ocean, and he spoke about how he's blown away by the amount of grape varieties in such a small country. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Oh, completely, and in fact, both across that and across climate change, because actually the two areas are sort of very interlinked. Partly, one of the joys is that because Portugal sits at the edge of Europe, In a sense, its wine industry internationally has been very much focused around ports, which everybody kind of sold as ports, so nobody ever really worried what the grape varieties were in it. It has meant that it's maintained this rich biodiversity of different varieties. There are lots of really good reasons why you have a lot of grape varieties, and in many ways, if you get really good at winemaking, there are fewer reasons to go and have a lot of varieties, because you end up being able to ride the peaks and troughs of different vintages. So you don't need to go and have late ripening grapes as well as really, really early ripening grapes, to sort of hedge your bets. So actually, when you take a lot of wineries, and Bordeaux is a very good example, you've got Merlot, which is very early ripening, but then you might go and have things like Petit Verdot, which come around much later, and you can fiddle around with them a bit, depending on whether or not it was an early or a late harvest, or whether you completely lost part of the crop to frost or something like that. Particularly hail can be an issue, and you can get late summer rain and that sort of thing. Now, Portugal, sitting so close to the ocean, is particularly vulnerable to that sort of dramatic seasonal change, because it's getting all these things coming through. It doesn't have in that sense, it's a weather influenced climate rather than a seasonally influenced climate. Where it gets really interesting is when you intersect that with some of the work around climate change, because it means that we do know Portugal has great varieties that can sustain changes in the climate. We are undoubtedly going to have to do two things, particularly in the wine world. One is to adapt to the changes that are already in place, they're already in motion, and we will have to adapt to those. Wine is the canary in the mine of climate change. If you think that a grape in a bottle of wine can express changes from vintage to vintage, it's certainly going to start being able to express changes from, as the climate changes dramatically over a period of time. And it already does. Alcohol levels are high and so on. So that's one part where the Porto Protocol, which I know sounds like a rather arcane thing, it's all industry people, it is actually going to have an impact on the way we drink. I can give you a very practical example. More than half the carbon emissions of a bottle of wine on your table globally come from moving the glass bottle around. So it's somewhere in the region between 50 and 60% of the carbon emissions of a bottle of wine is just spent making that glass bottle and shifting it about the globe. So it's nothing to do with the grape. It's not even about shifting the wine in that bottle around the globe. It's just the glass. So we made, with the wine show, we loved being there so much, we made two wines. So we've got a red and a white, and the white comes from Lisbon, the red's from Alentejo, and it's in a box because we just stripped out the glass bit. So what we did was we packed it into big tankers in Portugal. They come across the sea, which is a relatively low carbon emissions way of transporting wine. And in the UK, where we sell it, it gets filled into boxes and we sell it out. And of course, 3 litre box. So I can't remember what it is. I mean, it dramatically reduces the carbon emissions more than 10 times.
Amazing.
So we're going to see more of that. Wine's going to come in cans. Wine, Portuguese wine being bottled in the UK or in the United States. Actually, there is a place for bottles. They're nice. About 90% of wine, there's a strong argument that you should go and bottle it in the country of origin. So actually, let's go and send it to the UK, bottle it there, where it can be done really super uber efficiently, and then you're only actually moving the glass the last 50 miles, 100 miles, rather than several thousand. So we will see those sort of changes, but I think that actually only happens when winemakers talk to each other. So a winemaker says, I've discovered this amazing thing with Orinto, and it turns out it's amazingly adaptable to this particular soil or these sort of climatic conditions. And someone goes, well, what I might go and do is I might lift some of my Cercial and put some Orinto in there, or, whatever, might even be vice versa. And you'll get the same sort of, action. And I think then the Porto Protocol is going to take that much more globally as well. So it's, Portugal is it's at the cutting edge, actually, of wine and climate change through initiatives like that and through other things.
I'm going to ask you a question that might be a bit cruel because of where you are. We were connected on Instagram, and I see your Instagram photos of you with a full white beard in the snow, minus 28 degrees. Imagine you could live here in Portugal. Is there a particular place that you would like to live?
I do have a particular soft spot for Porto. And, I'm not I know a lot of people have moved to the Algarve. I know various people actually got, moved full time to the Algarve. I'm not a great hot weather person. As you can imagine, you're the sort of idiot that goes running when it's minus 25 on the snow. And my eyes froze the other day, and you sort of think, what am I doing? My eyes are beginning to freeze now, and I had to sort of go inside. Then you're not the sort of person who, you're the sort of person who can cope with it not being terribly warm and hot. So one of those things I quite liked about Porto is, you can go into the mountains and actually becomes quite cool, and you go and have a bike ride and get right sort of up. I love being kind of high up. And also, I really quite like that sort of cooling breeze. And, in the winter, it's, it can be pretty brutal, but I quite like that, wind-lashed walks along the coast, and the seafood is just utterly fabulous. And I think certainly for British people, there is an element of comfort about seeing English names and Scottish names and Irish names dotted around and about, and I've always rather enjoyed that kind of history. And as a city, I've become very fond of it because I sort of know my way around a little bit now, sort of trundling about. And
are there any places that you will still want to visit, that you'd like to visit, whether it's wine related or not wine related?
You mentioned the places to the far north. I'd love to go and visit the real far north of Portugal, actually. I think it was really interesting. I know there's these sort of fascinating culinary traditions and history, particularly when you get to that sort of Spanish border area around there. And in fact, I was at school with a guy who lived around and about there. I remember, no, this is 30 odd years ago, but I remember him talking about it. It just sounded like a really fascinating place to sort of go. And the other area, I'm quite a fan of sort of rather literal places, sort of on the edges. I'd love to go and visit the sort of borderlands in the mountains and go right up into the sort of real mountains. We forget just how remote and cut off certainly the sort of upper Douro was until the railway came through. And there are still places, when you get up into those sort of high mountain passes and so on, which are relatively untouched in that sense. You are sort of right up in there. I never got to the Azores, and the wine scene in the Azores is absolutely amazing. It was a Pico particularly, and so I would really love to go and see what's a very ancient viticulture. It's an old and untouched one that sits right out in the ocean. I would love to go and see sort of that. So there are, that's the challenge though. I've been, not the challenge, it's the joy. I've been to Portugal quite a bit in the last couple of years, left in a considerable hurry. I think we were the last flight on tap to go from Lisbon to London, or near enough when we left. We didn't have to race down the motorway because all the crew were desperate to get home to their families for lockdown. But I know I can come back and find more utterly fascinating places. Charlotte did a lovely film, I think it was in Alentejo, where she was at a pig farm, and I've yet to go to a pig farm. In fact, two places I've still not been to. I've not been to a proper pig farm, and whilst I've been into a cork forest, I haven't been into a working active cork forest. I really love to go to see that. I'm a big cork freak in the sense I love it. I think cork's amazing, and I'm a huge advocate of cork. I think that it's very unfairly maligned. I think there's most extraordinary work has gone into cork. I think we don't realise how much of an influence around the planet and through technology, even into the space shuttle. There's cork, modern spacecraft all have cork in them somewhere. I think every car engine bay pretty much in the world has a piece of cork in it in some capacity. I'm a great fan of behavioural science, behavioural economics. And somebody once asked me to defend cork. And I said, look, even if 2% of bottles of wine, I think that's probably more than there are, but even a couple of percent of bottles of wine had some sort of taint in it, we know that the sound of a cork coming out of a bottle, not even looking at it, the mere sound of it makes somebody think, they make somebody value a bottle of wine 15% more. So if you simply do the maths on it, it's worthwhile putting corks in. We get more pleasure, 15% more, if you like, hedonic pleasure out of a bottle of wine where we hear that sound coming out. It's worth the fact that sometimes it's not, historically it hasn't been the world's perfect sealant, and actually now it's pretty much there. Compared with other sort of, there are other challenges. That wine's a living thing. It's a living thing. There are other things that go and affect it. So no, I'm a total cork advocate. I'm a big fan, and we know the important biodiversity. The European lynx, I think, tends to live in cork forests. I know there's sort of eagles and so on. It's an incredibly important environment for an awful lot of particularly European species,
Yeah.
megafauna.
One of the reasons they planted cork historically was also to prevent desertification as well, which is fascinating. But I will recommend two areas that you should come and visit next time. One you mentioned sort of the nearer to the Spanish border in those mountainous regions. We call it the Baía de Interior in Portugal. And the reason there's a village there called Covilhã, and I think you'd be fascinated with the history of that because of your background with north of England and the wool. That was considered the Manchester of Portugal.
I've got to go there.
So you got to go there. And then Abidos, which is where I live, to come and have a meal and to come and drink a bottle of wine at one of my favorite wine producers, which is a little wine producer called Quinta Sanguinhal in Abidos. They're one of the oldest in the region as well. And the wine is just fantastic. So yeah, those are my two recommendations. That
I'll bring a couple of bottles. In fact, I'll bring a couple from Quinta de Esperança, which is a relatively new producer, so we can have really old, traditional, and modern. And actually, that's a lot of the story of Portuguese wine: is extraordinary history and the sort of modern end.
Exactly.
It'll be a dinner. Don't say this, Dylan. Everyone's going to want to join us.
Deal. Yeah. No. Well, it's a closed invitation.
50,000 people coming to your house for dinner.
Bring that actor that cries when he drinks wine. We could have him around just for a laugh,
Honestly, you wouldn't have to ask him twice. Apart from anything else, he's a big wine fan, and we've done various things like this. We do lockdown tastings.
What do you want to say about Portuguese people? Having traveled, having spoken to so many different people in the times that you've come here, what do you want to say and tell people about Portuguese people?
You know what? People are unbelievably friendly. There's one guy particularly who's called Jose, and then we suddenly realised I was Joe and he was Jose, and he was a baker in Setúbal. I can't remember which episode it's in. Honestly, there were tears running down my face after we filmed with him. It was just the most amusing morning, and the other one was, you would just be welcomed into these extraordinary communities of people, and before you knew it, everybody had had a drink and we're having a bit of a dance, and it's all kind of funny. There were some fishermen in Ericeira, and we got awfully worried because one of them was sort of saying this thing that was like chaka, 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 chaka. And we suddenly worried that it was something incredibly rude in Portuguese. So we had to ask various Portuguese friends, he's not saying something rude before we broadcast this to 80 million people around the world. And he said, no, he's just having a bit of a laugh. I've still got his fisherman's cap. He said, no, you must have my cap because with your head, you're going to get sunburned. So I have this. It still smells of fish. This little seaman's cap that I took away. And we took his hands. I got little lily-livered typing hands. These big seaman's hands, sort of each finger was like a big sausage. And they just, come on in, you're part of the gang. Oh, we're going to have lots of fun. Oh, it's going to be, great. So, we met just wonderful, sort of beautiful people. Young women who'd taken over family vineyards, and they were utterly committed to going and transforming the way that they were going to work, and they were taking on these legacies. There's a brilliant woman. She's the chef sommelier, funny for the Taylor's Hotel, the Yeatman in the Douro, and she just took me off on this odyssey of all these wines that we should go and sort of learn about. Everybody was amazingly welcome, and you'd start trying to speak a bit of Portuguese, and they'd have a bit of fun, and Josh and play around with it for a while. And in Sweden I try and speak Swedish, and people instantly answer you in English, which is really irritating. In Portugal they'll carry on up to the point where everybody's falling about laughing, and they go, it's all right. I went to university in Birmingham. Oh my God. Next time we start talking English with you. But that was one of those nice bits. And then if you get the pronunciation right,
But Joe, how can people follow you online and follow your work and follow what you're up to next?
It's a terrible idea to follow me online because it's all daft. No, I'm Joe Fattorini at everything. So at Joe Fattorini, Joe with an E. Joye, as I sort of universally become when you go to countries like Portugal that pronounce all the diphthongs. So yeah, Joye Fattorini, but Joe Fattorini. Follow the Wine Show. So at Wine Show TV, you will find us on platforms around the world in various markets. We're certainly on Amazon in an awful lot of countries, but then we broadcast on broadcast platforms. So Gorda in the Scandinavian countries, and Nat Geo in various other parts of the world. It's always quite interesting when we go to places, you get stopped and there's somebody from South Korea who's been watching you the week before. and go, this is a little bit weird. I'm now someone like an Eritrea, and there's somebody from South Korea who's been watching me on TV. So we do get that. So we're about to launch series 3, I think, in the United States, which is very much the Portuguese series. But we do have an episode in series 1, and then there's various other spots.
The Portuguese series is being shown right now in Portugal on Kitchen 24. So everyone needs to watch Kitchen 24. I think we're up to episode 4 at the moment. So I've already seen James cry, which was great.
You've seen James, yeah, episode 4, see James cry. So no, absolutely get in touch. And, one of the things I really love hearing from particularly is wine producers. So if you're a wine producer and you're listening to this, particularly in Portugal, get in touch, through any of those sort of various formats. You find me on LinkedIn, because we love being able to sort of connect people up as wine producers to, interesting new markets. And certainly I think we've had an understanding of what Portugal needs to do to go and get itself out. So wine producers who are listening, give us a shout, because we'd love to help out.
Wonderful. Joe, a question that we ask all of our guests: Portugal, the simple life, why?
For me, it's the wine. It's the wine. Long into the night, some of the greatest wine dinners I've ever had. It's coming and drinking some of the great wines of the world.
Brilliant. That's a good one. I haven't had anybody say it's just because of the wine, so we'll take it. But I maybe should have seen it coming.
Brilliant.
Joe, I've loved this conversation. Let's stay in touch. Please come and visit us in Portugal. You're always welcome, and I look forward to seeing you when you're here. And for now, I'm going to let you call it.
That's a wrap.
So thank you once again to Joe, and thank you to all of you for listening. Please subscribe, share with your friends, give us a thumbs up, and please leave a comment or a review. We'd love to hear from you. And as we say in Portugal, a nossa. Welcome to the simple life.